It was the summer of 1518, in the bustling city of Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire. The streets were alive with the usual noise of markets and guilds, the clatter of carts, and the chanting of church bells. Life was hard, but not unusual for its time. Yet one ordinary morning, something extraordinary happened. Something that would plunge the entire city into fear and confusion. On a narrow cobblestone street, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped outside. She was not dressed for performance, nor was there any music to accompany her. Yet, for reasons that remain a mystery to this day, she began to dance. First, neighbors laughed. They thought it was a prank, a moment of silliness in a grim world. Frau Trophia danced with jerky, determined movements, as if she could not stop herself. The day grew hot under the July sun, but she continued, spinning and stomping as sweat soaked her gown. When the sun fell, she was still moving. By nightfall, concern replaced laughter. Frau Trophia's husband begged her to rest. Others tried to restrain her, but it was useless. Her body refused to stop. Even when her legs trembled and her feet bled, she danced. Witnesses said her face was twisted between pain and ecstasy, as though she was both suffering and compelled by an unseen force. She danced through the night and then through the next day and then another. By the end of the week, Frau Trophia was not alone. A handful of others had joined her, men and women alike, moving uncontrollably, as if caught in the same strange spell. Within days, there were dozens. The spectacle drew crowds. People gathered in shock as their neighbors flailed and spun in the streets. Some cheered, thinking it was entertainment. But the truth quickly became terrifying. The dancers could not stop. Their feet blistered and bled. Their bodies collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again and continue moving. Word spread through Strasbourg like wildfire. Officials of the city council were horrified. Priests muttered that it was a curse from God, perhaps punishment for sins. Others whispered of Saint Vitus, a saint believed to have the power to curse people into uncontrollable dance. The plague was already being called the curse of Saint Vitus. Doctors were summoned, but in 1518, medicine was little more than guesswork. They examined the dancers and concluded that their bodies were overheated, filled with hot blood. Their solution was chilling. The only cure was to let them dance it out. So instead of stopping the madness, authorities made it worse. They cleared public halls and marketplaces to give the dancers space. They even built a stage in the city center and brought in musicians, drummers, and pipers to play. The theory was that music would help the dancers purge the sickness from their bodies. But if Strasbourg hoped to end the madness, it had unleashed something far darker. With space to gather and music to drive them, the dancers multiplied. Soon there were not dozens, but hundreds. Ordinary citizens, rich and poor alike, found themselves caught up in the frenzy. Some joined willingly, believing it to be a spiritual ritual. Others screamed in terror as their legs refused to obey, dragged into the endless rhythm against their will. The sight was horrifying. Men collapsing only to rise again, women foaming at the mouth, children dragged into the madness. The city that had once laughed at a single woman's odd behavior was now facing an epidemic unlike anything it had ever seen. And as the sound of drums echoed across Strasbourg, one question haunted everyone. What dark force had gripped their city, and how far would it spread? By the second week of July 1518, the city of Strasbourg was no longer amused by the strange woman who had danced in the street. What began as one woman's uncontrollable movements had become a terrifying spectacle. Dozens of men and women were now caught in the same frenzy. They danced in the markets, in the alleys, on the steps of the cathedral. Their feet struck the cobblestones until their shoes split open, and yet they could not stop. Crowds gathered in horror. People whispered prayers as they watched neighbors collapse, only to rise again and resume their wild movements. Some dancers screamed in agony, their faces twisted in pain, while others appeared lost in a trance, eyes glazed, limbs jerking to a rhythm that no one else could hear. By the third week, the numbers exploded. Chroniclers reported as many as 400 people caught in the mania. The city seemed cursed. Men abandoned their workshops, Women left their kitchens, and entire families watched helplessly as loved ones were dragged into the endless, punishing dance. Doctors and priests argued furiously over the cause. Some claimed it was the wrath of God, a punishment for sin. Others insisted it was a natural illness, a disease of hot blood. They called it, but all agreed on one thing. The dancers could not stop until the sickness had run its course. And so, the authorities of Strasbourg made a fateful decision. Instead of banning the dancing, they encouraged it. The city council ordered that a large guild hall be cleared, along with an open marketplace. Wooden stages were built so the afflicted could gather in one place. Then, to make matters worse, musicians were hired. Drummers, pipers, and fiddlers filled the air with sound, believing that music would help the dancers expel the sickness. The result was catastrophic. With the beat of drums driving them, the afflicted danced harder, faster, more violently. The frenzy spread like fire. People who had only come to watch sometimes found themselves swept into the madness, their own bodies beginning to move uncontrollably. The sound of flutes and drums, meant as a cure, became the rhythm of a nightmare. Day and night, the city echoed with the stamping of feet and the cries of exhaustion. Witnesses described men foaming at the mouth, women tearing their clothes, and children fainting from the strain. Some collapsed and never rose again, their bodies broken by exhaustion or claimed by sudden strokes and heart attacks. But still, the music played. The council, desperate and confused, believed they were helping. Instead, they had created a stage for an epidemic. The more the afflicted danced, the more joined them. It seemed as if Strasbourg itself had become a theater of madness, the entire city trapped in a deadly performance. Neighbors began to fear one another. Was this a sickness that could spread through touch, through sight, through air? No one knew. Some locked their doors and shuttered their windows, praying not to be caught. Others gathered at church, begging for divine mercy. Priests warned that Saint Vitus, the holy protector of dancers, had cursed the people for their sins. Only prayer and penance, they said, could lift the affliction. But while the faithful prayed, the music continued, and the dancers stamped on. By late July, the streets of Strasbourg looked less like a city and more like a battlefield. Dozens of bodies lay sprawled in exhaustion while others leapt and spun until their bones cracked. Physicians, powerless, offered no remedies beyond more dancing. And the council, unable to stop what they had unleashed, could only watch in horror as the city spiraled deeper into chaos. The dancing plague was no longer a curiosity. It was a disaster. And as the summer sun beat down on the city, Strasbourg began to ask the question that terrified them most. How many would have to die before the dance came to an end? By late July, Strasbourg was no longer a city of merchants and craftsmen. It had become a city of dancers and of corpses. What began with Frau Trophia had spread into a nightmare that seemed without end. Hundreds were still caught in the frenzy. Their feet struck the cobblestones until their soles split and their bones cracked. Some wore their skin down to raw flesh, leaving trails of blood across the streets. Others collapsed, trembling and gasping, only to rise again as though forced by some invisible hand. The city echoed with cries of agony. Witnesses said the sound of drums, hired to cure the dancers, blended with screams of the dying. Men begged for the madness to end. Women sobbed as they tried to hold their bodies still, only to be thrown back into the rhythm. Children fainted and lay motionless, while their parents staggered on in horror. Deaths began to mount. Chroniclers wrote of people dancing until their hearts gave out, their bodies falling lifeless in the street. Others died of strokes, their faces frozen mid-contortion. It was as though death itself had joined the dance. And still the musicians played. Ordered by the council, they filled the streets with music to help the sick purge their affliction. But the more the drums pounded, the more frantic the dancers became. Strasbourg had turned into a grotesque carnival of exhaustion, pain, and death. Priests warned that this was the work of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. They said the people had angered him with their sins, and now he cursed them to dance until they died. Desperate families carried loved ones to shrines, lighting candles and praying for mercy. Some even tied strips of cloth to statues of saints, hoping their suffering would end. But mercy did not come. Day after day, the dancers spun and staggered. Witnesses claimed that some appeared possessed, their eyes rolling back, their mouths foaming, their limbs jerking like puppets. Others seemed trapped in a trance, their faces blank, their bodies moving in endless circles. To outsiders, Strasbourg looked cursed, a city under divine punishment. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Surrounding villages refused to enter the city. Merchants stayed away. Travelers spoke in hushed voices about the dancing madness. Some swore they had seen demons lurking at the edges of the crowds. Others claimed the devil himself had entered Strasbourg to claim its people. But behind the rumors, the truth was undeniable. The people were dying. Chroniclers could not agree on numbers. Some claimed dozens, others hundreds, but all agreed that the deaths were horrifying. And the worst part was that no one knew how to stop it. The council grew desperate. Physicians admitted their mistake. The music, the stages, the open spaces had only fed the frenzy. Priests called for mass processions and acts of penance. But still the dancers stamped on, as though Strasbourg itself was trapped in a ritual it could not escape. As July turned into August, the city was exhausted, terrified, and grieving. Families buried their dead while others still twitched and spun in the streets. The dancing plague had become more than an illness. It was a spectacle of suffering, a vision of hell on earth. And yet, even in the face of death, the dancers moved on. Their bloodied feet struck the ground like drums of doom, and their broken bodies rose again, compelled by a force no one could explain. Strasbourg was running out of time. And now the city turned its eyes to the church, to faith, to saints, to the hope that prayer could succeed where reason and medicine had failed. By August of 1518, Strasbourg was a city in despair. The streets were littered with exhausted bodies, yet the dancing continued. Some staggered through the market square like broken marionettes. Others collapsed against cathedral walls, twitching to a rhythm no one else could hear. The question that haunted the city was simple. Why? The council turned to the church. Priests declared that the people had angered Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. They claimed the citizens were cursed, condemned to dance until they sought forgiveness. To appease him, the clergy ordered processions and pilgrimages. Families carried afflicted loved ones to shrines dedicated to the saint, tying scraps of cloth to statues as offerings. Some dancers were taken to chapels where priests pressed crosses to their foreheads, sprinkling holy water in hopes of breaking the curse. Rumors spread that those who danced were possessed by demons. Neighbors whispered of shadows moving in the night, of strange voices heard when the afflicted cried out. Some swore they saw women's hair twist like serpents as they spun, or men's eyes glow red in the torchlight. Fear fed the legend. This was no illness, it was a visitation of evil. Others insisted it was divine punishment. The city had fallen into sin, they said, and God himself had struck down Strasbourg with madness. Priests preached repentance from the pulpit, urging citizens to confess, fast, and pray. Entire households marched barefoot through the streets, chanting hymns and begging for mercy. Yet still, the dancing continued. Physicians, meanwhile, clung to their diagnosis of hot blood. They believed the afflicted suffered from overheated humors that forced their limbs into motion. The cure, they insisted, was more dancing. But as more bodies fell lifeless in the streets, even the doctors began to doubt their reasoning. The council's response grew desperate. They funded more religious rituals, building altars to Saint Vitus. They banned certain gatherings, fearful that crowds encouraged the mania. Yet in secret, many officials confessed their terror. What if this madness spread to nearby towns? What if it consumed all of Strasbourg? Chronicles describe the atmosphere as one of dread and suspicion. Families hid their children indoors. Merchants closed their shops. Some residents fled the city entirely, believing it cursed. Pilgrims arriving in Strasbourg carried tales of the dancing plague across Europe, turning the city into a grim legend. But explanations brought little comfort. Whether it was demons, saints, or hot blood, the result was the same. Men, women, and even children continued to spin and collapse in agony. In one desperate act, the council organized a mass pilgrimage. Groups of dancers were herded to the shrine of Saint Vitus in nearby Saverne. Priests led them barefoot, chanting prayers as bells rang out. At the chapel, afflicted dancers were placed before relics of the saint. Some were strapped into place, their feet bound in red shoes, symbolic of burning out the sickness. Others had crosses pressed into their palms as they convulsed. To the shock of witnesses, some dancers seemed to quiet after these rituals. Their bodies finally stilled, their eyes fluttered shut. Word spread that the curse might finally be lifting. But for many others, the madness raged on. The city was torn between hope and horror. Faith had offered a flicker of relief, yet the plague still stalked Strasbourg streets. And now whispers began to spread of stranger causes. Poisons in the bread, curses in the air, or even plots by enemies of the city. The search for explanations had only deepened the mystery. And as the dancers' bloodied feet stamped on, Strasbourg faced the terrible realization. Perhaps there was no cure at all. Centuries have passed since the summer of 1518, yet the mystery of Strasbourg's dancing plague still haunts historians and scientists. Chroniclers described hundreds of people spinning and collapsing until death, but why they danced remains one of history's strangest puzzles. Today, modern theories try to explain what terrified the people of Strasbourg, and each is as fascinating as it is unsettling. One of the most popular explanations is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a toxic fungus that grows on rye and other grains. When consumed, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and muscle spasms. Some scholars argue that Strasbourg's bread supply may have been contaminated. If entire families ate infected bread, they could have suffered collective spasms that looked like dancing. This theory is tempting. The symptoms match, and ergot has been linked to other outbreaks of strange behavior in history. But ergot alone may not explain everything. Victims of ergotism are usually bedridden, their muscles locked in painful convulsions. The people of Strasbourg, however, moved for days, even weeks, in a frenzied rhythm. Their motions were not just seizures, they looked like an endless, unstoppable dance. That leads to another theory, mass hysteria, or what scientists call a psychogenic epidemic. In times of great stress, fear can spread like disease. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under enormous strain. Harvests had been poor, famine threatened, and outbreaks of illness were common. Add to this a deeply religious culture where people believed saints could punish sin with curses, and you have the perfect conditions for hysteria. In this view, Frau Trophia may have been the spark. When she began to dance, her neighbors, already anxious and fearful, may have been swept into the same behavior. Psychologists say the body can mimic what the mind believes. Entire groups can share the same physical symptoms, even without a physical cause. In a way, the people of Strasbourg may have danced themselves into madness simply because they believed they were cursed. Another explanation combines both ideas. Perhaps ergot poisoning created strange sensations in the body, while hysteria magnified the effect. A few convulsions became contagious panic, spreading until hundreds were caught in the plague. Still others point to religion and ritual. Dancing manias were not unique to Strasbourg. Records from medieval Europe describe other outbreaks, often linked to the cult of Saint Vitus. People believed that by dancing in his honor, they could avoid his curse. In Strasbourg, fear of the saint may have turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people believed they were cursed to dance, the more their bodies obeyed. Some modern scholars even suggest political motives. Could rival factions in the city have used the panic to discredit each other? Could poison bread have been a deliberate act? There is no solid evidence, but in a world of guild rivalries and church politics, the idea cannot be dismissed. In the end, the truth may never be known. The sources we have are few, written by clerics and officials who interpreted events through the lens of religion. What is clear is that the dancing plague was real, and it terrified everyone who saw it. Whether it was poison, hysteria, or a curse, Strasbourg in 1518 became the stage for one of history's strangest tragedies. People danced not for joy but for survival and often for death. But one final question remains. What happened to the dancers? By September of 1518, the frenzy in Strasbourg had finally begun to fade. Some said the curse of Saint Vitus had been lifted after desperate pilgrimages and rituals. Others believed exhaustion and death had simply burned out the madness. Chroniclers reported that survivors were carried to a shrine in Saverne, where priests placed red shoes on their feet and pressed relics of the saint to their bodies. Slowly, painfully, the dancing stopped, but the scars remained. Families buried their dead, while survivors carried memories of limbs that moved against their will, of nights filled with drums, and of streets echoing with screams. Strasbourg returned to its trade and festivals, but no one forgot the summer when the city became a stage for death. The legacy of the dancing plague is more than tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the fears and beliefs of its age. To the people of 1518, the event was proof of divine wrath, a punishment from heaven. To us, it is a reminder of how fragile the human mind and body can be under pressure. Hunger, fear, and faith combined into something no one could control. Art and culture preserved the terror. Painters began to depict the danse macabre or dance of death, a grim procession of skeletons leading kings, peasants, and queens alike into the grave. The message was clear. No one escapes death, no matter how rich or powerful. The plague of Strasbourg had made this lesson all too real. For centuries, stories of the dancers were told as warnings. Parents whispered of them to frighten children into obedience. Priests preached of them as examples of sin and punishment. Historians puzzled over the madness, and scientists continue to debate it even now. And perhaps that is the strangest part. The dancing plague has never been fully explained. Was it poisoned bread, mass hysteria, or something more? Some say it was the body rebelling against hunger and despair. Others believe it was the mind collapsing under fear. But in Strasbourg, many went to their graves believing it was the curse of a saint. As night falls on the city today, the cobblestones of Strasbourg still hold their secrets. Tourists walk the same streets where, 500 years ago, men and women stamped their lives away. Some say if you stand in the market square in silence, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of drums, the shuffle of tired feet, and the cries of those who could not stop. The dancing plague ended long ago, but its mystery endures. And perhaps that is its true legacy, a reminder that history is not only wars and kings, but also the unexplainable moments when ordinary people were caught in forces beyond reason. The citizens of Strasbourg danced until their bodies broke, until their hearts gave out, until death itself joined the rhythm. And though the plague ended, one haunting question lingers, even after 5 centuries.